It's an interesting time right now, this time in history, this time in our lives, but also just this week. We have Women's History Month. Our Jewish friends are celebrating Purim this weekend, which is a really fun and fabulous celebration of another time that Jews escaped certain death. Purim, it actually really is a fun celebration. I didn't explain that well, but we have too much to talk about today for me to go much further into that. We are still in the middle of the month of Ramadan. Our Muslim brothers and sisters are celebrating Ramadan. We just had the spring equinox. Pagans everywhere celebrate spring equinox. And today, of course, in the Christian calendar is Palm Sunday. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about Palm Sunday as a metaphor. We're going to get really big with it, and then we're going to get really, really personal. And we're going to talk about what Palm Sunday means for us. So I can't really tell you the story of Palm Sunday without starting with what happened before Palm Sunday. You know, the master teacher Jesus had been doing his ministry for about 3 years, and he had been super successful. Like everywhere he went, people just got up and just followed along. Why can't y'all be more like that? I'm just kidding. We don't look for followers here, by the way. We look for doers. We want you doing metaphysics. We want you living your life to the fullest. So that was completely a joke. So as Jesus is approaching Jerusalem, probably for the Feast of Purim, is why he was heading into Jerusalem. He had built up quite a name for himself, and he had built up a following. And people were starting to recognize him, and people were starting to literally, physically follow him. So as he's approaching Jerusalem, he gets a message that a family friend named Lazarus had passed away. And Jesus said, all right, take me to the cemetery. And so they did. They took him to the cemetery, and they were like, Jesus, we know you can do some things. We saw you raise the centurion's servant from the dead, but Lazarus has been gone for 4 days. And so we just wanted you to know that's why he wasn't going to be here with you as you enter Jerusalem. And he said, take me to the cemetery. So they got to the cemetery, and he said, will you go ahead and roll that stone away? And they were like, what? No. He goes, just go ahead, just do it. And they said, well, okay. So as they were getting ready to do that, he looked around, and this is one of my favorite parts of the Bible. He goes, hey, God, I already know you're here, but there are a lot of people here, and I want them to know you're here too. So thank you for what's about to happen. So thank you for what's about to happen. And they rolled the stone away, and Lazarus came out. So that is the literal story that we read in the Bible. But what we know is that metaphysics isn't literal. Metaphysics is a story that applies to us. So when I was reading about the metaphysical meaning of Lazarus, what I learned is the entire ministry of Jesus is about consciousness. We are raising our consciousness to the awareness of the divine presence in our lives. This is what Jesus taught over and over and over again. We're raising consciousness. It is the acknowledgement and the gratitude that the divine is here. This is an important moment. Because then what happens is Jesus proceeds to head towards Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem is really interesting, and I'd like for you to hear this really in the context of everything that is happening in Israel today. And then we'll talk about what it means for us today. Jerusalem's really interesting because the name Jerusalem literally means, if you can take any Hebrew word literally because every Hebrew word has 1,000 interpretations. And I really went down the rabbit hole this week for you people. There are a lot of different interpretations of what the word Jerusalem means, but the one that I found most compelling is this. Jeru comes from the root Hebrew word yara, which means to rain or to flow. But it doesn't just mean to rain or to flow. It means like the kind of rain that is a whole lot of tiny raindrops that create a deluge. So it's a lot of very small things coming together to create a big, important thing. It's that kind of flow. It's that kind of rain. So that's the Jeru part. And then shalom. Shalom is the verb to shalom. And shalom means peace. Shalom is to make peace. But an interesting side of that is shalom means to make peace through restoration, to make peace by restoring something. So Jerusalem means the flow of peace. I'm really struck by this idea that peace comes through an act of restitution. One Hebrew scholar that I read this week said, Jerusalem was meant to be the radiating heart of a world of completeness, peace, and wholeness. Isn't that interesting, given today's climate in Israel? The radiating heart of peace and wholeness. I was thinking about this dichotomy of what the intention is behind Jerusalem and the experience of the Israeli people. And as I was thinking about this week, I was having an interesting conversation with my high schooler, and she randomly brought up the Pledge of Allegiance. She goes, you know, Mom, several times a week they play the Pledge of Allegiance, like during homeroom, and everybody ignores it, except there's a handful of kids that stand up and say the pledge. And I was like, really? That's very different from the experience I had growing up in Texas in the 80s. And we were talking about it a little bit, and she said something that I found really interesting. She said, Mom, the thing that I've noticed is that the kids who are most likely the ones to stand up and pay attention are also the ones who are the least likely to uphold the ideals of oneness. And I thought, isn't that interesting? And the reason I tell you this is because what I said to her next was, you know, honey, I think that the Pledge of Allegiance is an ideal. It's a reminder of what we're capable of when we all get on the same page together. And I think that the same is true of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is an ideal. This flow of peace and restitution is an ideal. And it's something for us to live up to in the world. It is something for us to make whole in the world. So, back to Jesus. As Jesus is riding into Jerusalem, he approaches Jerusalem and someone brings him a donkey. And the reason this is important is because in the culture of the time, horses represent war and donkeys represent peace. And so Jesus got on the donkey and he goes into Jerusalem and he is showing that he is coming as a messenger of peace. Now, in Jerusalem at the time, there were three major Jewish sects. You might have heard of them: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. And each of these three sects had kind of split off from each other because each of them had different ideas about what the right way to do religion is. I can't relate to that at all in modern times. I don't know if you can. They split off. And each of these three different sects thought that they were the right one. And each one had their own rules and regulations and ideas about how to do it right. Again, can't relate at all. And so what they represent in metaphysics is the brain, whereas Jesus on the donkey of peace represents moving into the heart. Keep that in mind. The three different sects there inside the walls of Jerusalem had walled themselves in. They had each tried to be superior. They were shutting each other down. And because of that wall, the heart was shut down. So Jesus went into Jerusalem to teach, and he spent a very interesting week or so there. And while he was there, these three Jewish sects, especially the Pharisees, were so intimidated by him and his radical message of peace that they convinced the Roman governor to have him executed. More on that maybe next week. I don't know. I don't know. But I want to ask you, how often in your life does your intellect shut down your heart? Because that is what this story is about. And this is where the story gets personal. We try to rationalize our feelings away. We try to bypass our compassion with hard facts and logic. We ignore our inward experience and we look out there for validation, for truth. You know, Jesus, when he went into Jerusalem, he had people come and celebrate him and lay palms at his feet. Palms were the symbol of victory and peace. And they laid palms and they said, Hosanna, King of Peace, welcome, welcome, welcome. I don't know about you, but when I've managed to access compassion, nobody celebrates me. Nobody puts anything at my feet, Jen. Nobody. She told Michael, my husband, to take note. She needs palms. I don't really need palms. But it is a really good reminder of how often we look out there for that kind of validation that we probably are rarely going to get. If we're lucky, we got it from our families of origin. Many of us didn't. If we're lucky, we had a teacher who saw us and celebrated us, you know? If we're lucky, we have a partner or a best friend or a work husband that can do that for us, right? But it's very, very rare. So looking over your past, take a minute to make this personal. Are there times where you can see that you have shut your heart down? I bet that you had some really good reasons for that. I do. We don't just shut our hearts down because we don't feel like feeling anymore. We shut our hearts down because pain forces us to shut down. Disappointment, both in ourselves and in others, forces us to shut down. I'm reading more and more frequent studies about how modern living forces our hearts to shut down. If you experience any of the isms, racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, classism, sexism, heterosexism, any of the socially allowed shaming, such as fat shaming or gender shaming or any shaming, all of these experiences serve to shut down our hearts, and we do that to protect ourselves. It's the right thing to do when we're hurt, is to protect ourselves. Every single one of us has had experiences in the past that served to wall off our hearts. And as we grow and we mature, we have to ask ourselves if being shut down is still serving us. Because shut down means closed down. And when we're closed down, we aren't open to give and we aren't open to receive. We become these little islands of shutdownness. once we decide that we're really ready to let go and ready to forgive and ready to live in the fullness of who we are, what then? I remember when I first entered this teaching and I heard all of these wonderful ideas and these principles and these truths, and I took all of the classes and I showed up for all of the services, and I just kept having this question: how? How do we do this? How do we apply these principles? Well, Ernest Holmes had some ideas. Ernest Holmes says, there is but one healer, and this is the Spirit of truth. There is but one life principle, and this is God in us. There is but one final law. This is the law of good. There is but one ultimate impulsion, and this impulsion is love. So what does that mean? He said there's but one healer, and this is the Spirit of truth. There is one healer, and this is the Spirit of truth. We often say there's nothing to be healed, only truth to be revealed. It is that when we recognize the truth, not just in our minds, but in our hearts and in our bodies, when we recognize the truth of who we are and what we're capable of, healing starts to happen. And then he said, there's but one life principle, and this is God in us. There is one life principle, not two. There is not good and evil. There is the divine life. And it is the one principle. It is the one thing that is true of us. This is the life that breathes us, that beats our hearts. Then he said, there is but one final law, and this is the law of good. Those of you who have studied Ernest Holmes at all recognize that the law is really important to him, because the law is what takes our intentions, takes our desires, takes our prayers, takes our consciousness, and makes it form. And I kind of wish he'd chosen a different word for it. But what I like about the word law is impersonal. It responds to every single one of us alike. It is impersonal. And this kind of law, because it's impersonal, it is perfectly just. All we do is be who we are, and the law takes care of the rest. But then he said, there is but one ultimate impulsion, and this impulsion is love. What does impulsion mean? Impulsion means it's the force or motive behind an action or process. So let's read that again. There is but one ultimate force or motive, and this ultimate force is love. Kind of reminds me of what Jesus was teaching us all those years ago. We're all asked to make this journey to our hearts, every single one of us. Even the master teacher himself had to make this journey. And when enough of us do, we will begin to manifest the peace that was promised. But manifesting peace isn't something that other people are going to do for you. It is a very personal journey. Now, when Jesus made his journey into the heart of peace, he was met with celebrating crowds who put palms at his feet. And you know, most of us don't get that. So I want you to know right now, I celebrate you. I do. I celebrate your life. I celebrate every single time you chose compassion over fear. I celebrate every single time you had a difficult conversation that created a healthy boundary for yourself. I celebrate you. I celebrate every single awful experience that you had that you survived through. That deserves celebration. I deserve every single time. I deserve celebration too. I celebrate every single time you remembered that you deserve to be celebrated. Not just on your birthday, but we celebrate that too. Every day, every choice. But often we forget to celebrate the choices, the good choices, don't we? And sometimes we focus on the mistakes instead. So take just a minute. If you feel comfortable, you might put your hand on your heart. Say, I celebrate you. I celebrate you. Say it like you mean it. I celebrate you. There it is. Turn to your neighbor. I celebrate you. Yes. Turn to your other neighbor. I celebrate you. For those of you at home, let me be your witness. I celebrate you. Yeah, I celebrate you. Thanks, Jen. Do you feel what happened in the room? I wish you could see the faces. I celebrate you. Now, Jesus knew that he was walking into a bad situation, but he still chose to keep moving forward. He chose to stay in his heart. And I'm glad that he was celebrated at the end there. I am, because he did good work. So this is our invitation today, is to stay in our hearts as we move forward in life. I want to circle back to something that we mentioned earlier, this idea, sorry, Rand, this idea that peace and restitution are intimately tied. Peace and restitution. Restitution means to restore or establish again. To restore or establish again. Often we think about restitution in the context of a court settlement or as a social justice issue, and those are really, really important. But let's take a slightly different approach to restitution today, because often when we're talking about restitution, we're talking about something owed to us. We're talking about something someone owes us, or life owes me. But what we know is that this isn't an outside-in life. That's not how it works. So let's talk about the places where you are withholding forgiveness and restitution from yourself. Are you withholding forgiveness for that stupid thing you said? That's what I do. Ooh, those 2 a.m. moments when you just replay it over and over. Maybe you're holding on to regret for that financial decision you made, or the choice to trust that person. Maybe you're withholding forgiveness for falling for that stupid scam. Where do you keep yourself from being able to establish yourself again in your own innocence? This doesn't mean you didn't make a mistake. It means you don't identify as the mistake. A mistake is what you did. It is not who you are. And a reminder about this from the wonderful Brené Brown. She said, here is what is truly at the heart of wholeheartedness. Worthy now. Not if, not when. We're worthy of love and belonging now, right this minute, as is. As is, you are worthy of love and belonging. And in order to live in this wholeheartedness, as Brené calls it, to live in wholeheartedness, we first have to set ourselves free. Free from judgment, free from regret, free from our mistakes that we made in the past. So what would it mean to let yourself off the hook? What would it mean to stop identifying yourself with the mistake and instead to identify with your wholeheartedness? What we are learning is that judgment and regret are very strong beliefs, and they tend to get lodged not only in our brains and in our hearts, but they get lodged in our bodies as well. So I'm going to give you a little tool that you can use anytime, anywhere when you are in judgment. And you might be saying, Shelley, why are we talking about this now? I want you to think about this as like a preventative maintenance exercise. Because the less we are judging ourselves, the less lodges in our bodies, the happier and healthier we are on every level. So judgment is a killer. It is. It's bad for our mental health, it's bad for our emotional health, and it's bad for our physical health. So we're going to do a little preventative maintenance on judgment. When you notice yourself judging someone, criticizing, or complaining, I have 3 simple questions for you to ask. Where, why, and how? Where, why, and how? Where do I feel this in my body? So when I'm in judgment, well, of course, first you have to notice it. But once you get used to that, it's real easy to see. Real easy. So once you notice it, you locate it in your body. So when I notice judgment, I can usually locate it, and it is usually located in my power chakra. Oh, right here. But be open, because sometimes your body will surprise you. I have found judgment in my shoulders when I have been carrying too much and I didn't have time for anybody else's BS. I have found judgment in my knee when I was afraid to be flexible or I was afraid to take that next step forward in life. I have found judgment in my ear when I didn't want to hear the truth, right? So just ask your body, where am I feeling this judgment in your body? So the first question is where. The second question is why. Why am I experiencing this judgment? Here's the thing. There's always a story that you're telling yourself. There's always a backstory, and we're really good storytellers. We are brilliant at telling ourselves whatever we want to believe. Once you know what the story is, it's often easier to see it as just a story. It is not the holy truth that has been laid upon you. It's just a story that you're telling yourself. And that story is creating judgment. So number 1, where am I feeling it in my body? Number 2, why am I having this judgment? What story am I telling myself? And number 3, how does this judgment serve to keep me small? And that might feel hard to you, but every single limiting belief in judgment is always limiting. Every single limiting belief, by definition, is limiting you. All of them. Every single limiting belief is serving to keep you small. You don't deserve that, and you can free yourself when you open the door of your consciousness and let the light in. That's what the story of Lazarus taught us. You can do this about the driver that just cut you off. You can do this about the political ad on the TV. You can do this about your cubicle mate who will not stop complaining about your manager. You can do this about the neighbor who insists, bless his heart, on rolling the trash cans out at 4:30 every Friday morning. 4:30 every Friday morning. So let's use that as an example. Let's use that neighbor as an example. Bless his ever-loving heart. So, number 1, where do I feel this in my body? I actually did this just to make sure I was being authentic with you. Where do I feel that in my body? It's more like an all-over rage. And then I thought about it, and you know, the skin is an organ. And our skin is here to protect us from the things that we don't want getting in our bodies, right? It makes sense that the all-over rage was truly all over because where I felt it was in my skin, okay? So why am I holding on to this judgment? What's the story? Well, what I realize is just getting angry every Friday morning at 4:30 is a lot easier than having what might be a potentially difficult conversation with someone I barely know. It's just easier to be in judgment instead of being vulnerable. Number 3, how does this judgment serve to keep me small? It keeps me in righteous anger instead of seeking a greater truth to be known. It keeps me isolated instead of keeping me from knowing my neighbor. And what if I approached him and I said, "Hi, friend. I'm wondering if you would let my husband take your cans out when he takes our cans out." Do you see how he gets voluntold a lot? Sorry. What if? What else is possible? What else is possible in this relationship? What if I became friends with him first? And then a few months down the road, of patience and compassion on my part, I had the conversation. What if I stopped playing small and isolating and did the hard thing and got vulnerable? Do you see how these 3 questions served to get me out of judgment and into possibility? What if? What if? All right, so the 3 questions real quick. Where? Where do I feel it in my body? Why? Why am I holding on to this judgment? And how? How does the judgment serve to keep me small? Here's the thing. When we are centered in judgment for others, we are centered in judgment. You don't separate that out. Have you ever heard that saying, how you do one thing is how you do everything? This is what that's about. You don't get to be in judgment for this one person over here, but pretend you're not in judgment, that you aren't having a consciousness of judgment. It's the same thing with all of our consciousness. And so do we want to be living in a consciousness of judgment, or do we want to be living in our wholeheartedness? Because just like the Pharisees, we can choose to stay in our heads, in our judgment, or we can be like the master teacher and move into our hearts. Before we close, I just want to say one thing. If we have been living in judgment for others, then we have also been living in judgment for ourselves. And it's time to stop. And so we use these tools as a way to clean up our relationships. But what it does is it centers us in our truth, and it clears up our relationships with ourselves. It clears up my relationship with me, who I believe myself to be, and whose I believe myself to be. It clears it all up. So what would it look like to make restitution to yourself this day? What would it look like? You know, restitution is an apology, an amends, a promise not to do it again, and something tangible that reestablishes you in your innocence. You are not your mistakes. You made a mistake. There's a big difference. So what might it look like to make restitution to yourself today? And as each of us starts to clean up that relationship with ourselves, oh my God, the light in the world gets so strong. And this is how we make peace on our planet. This is how we make peace on our planet, by making peace within.